All right, ACC fans, we're just a little more than a week away from college football. It's the longest off season. We all wait and wait and wait, but it's almost here. And of course, to buy the time, this is ACC Breakdown, edition number 2. This is your show of record. This is where you have to be every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern for the live stream. Or you can catch us, of course, on Mark Rogers TV on YouTube, also covered by and posted by a number of SB Nation sites. Speaking of which, we've got an exclusive SB Nation panel tonight with Mr. Dan Rubin of BC Interruption. We've got Jim Hammett of Cardiac Hill, and, of course, Joey Weaver from the Rumble seat taking bragging rights tonight as we talk about the Coastal Division coming off the big 11-3 season from Georgia Tech and Coastal Division champs. So let's start right there, because what we're going to do here is we're going to talk exclusively Coastal Division. We're going to look at the Atlantic next week, which is going to bring us right into 2015. So let's set this thing up, guys. Of course, last season, this thing was muddled to begin with. The prognosticators didn't know who to pick. North Carolina was a bit of a favorite by many. Georgia Tech emerged to be by far the best team at 6-2. We had a couple at 4-4 in North Carolina and Duke. Georgia Tech not only wins the division, but the first team in several years that's won the division and also gained respect outside the division, competing against the Atlantic well in the ACC championship game, winning a game against Georgia, winning a game against Mississippi State. Hey, Joey, you take honors here since you're the Coastal Division reigning champion. We'll start with your thoughts on the division race transitioning from 14 to 15 here.
Sure. So forgot my title belt at home, I guess, but it was definitely an exciting season for Georgia Tech last year. A lot of fans kind of weren't really expecting it. It was interesting how at the beginning of the year, and even I remember at halftime of the first game, I mean, there was an outroar of "Fire Paul Johnson! This is terrible! You know, burn it all down and start it all over." But moving into 15, I think the race sets up to be just what you've come to expect from the ACC, where there's about 5 legitimate contenders that could win the division. Georgia Tech obviously is the reigning champion, but there's also some very good suitors as well, with North Carolina, Miami, Virginia Tech, and Pittsburgh might even be a dark horse in there as well. And so I think it sets up to be another wild and crazy season of ACC football that we've all come to know and love.
Hey, Dan, while you sit there waiting patiently, figuring out who you're going to predict to face BC in the ACC championship game, we'll pitch it to Jim first. Jim, you step in here. Give us your thoughts. Of course, you're closest to the Pitt situation, but have a handle on the entire division that's been very muddled in a certain sense, but at the same time, I was looking at the ACC championship game results, and Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech have dominated this division since its inception. 9 of 10 title game appearances out of those two schools.
Yeah, we're just talking about this division and how it is so muddled, but you kind of look at it just from the outside real quick. You look at Virginia, and sometimes in certain divisions you can pick out who the best team is. This one you can kind of pick out who the worst team is. No offense to Virginia, but I think you could start with them at number 7, then you work your way up, and pretty much 6 through 1 you can shuffle them up, and anything can happen, really.
Dan, we'll let you chime in here. So Dan, we left him off the contributors list this week, and man, he pinch hits at the last second, jumps on in here. So Dan, representing BC, chime in on the Coastal. What do you see in this division this season?
The polar opposite of the Atlantic Division. The Atlantic Division, you kind of think about, and you think about the teams at the top. You think about your clear-defined middle, and then you think of your bottom, and then after the bottom is Syracuse down there in the way bottom. In the Coastal Division, when you think about it, there's no way to predict anything other than that Virginia probably by default might finish dead last in the division. And even then, I don't think anybody could pick that objectively. I think when you look at this division, top to bottom, it's wide open. I think that all of these teams, if something breaks the right way, could be just as good as anyone else. And really, that's all that matters. All you got to do is get in that ACC championship game, and then once you get the win, you're into the New Year's Six. So anything is possible in this ACC Coastal Division, and trying to pick out who's going to be the team. Well, that's going to be the interesting thing for me.
So, Joey, we're all picking on poor Virginia, and to highlight it, they might face the toughest non-conference slate in the country, Boise State, Notre Dame, and also UCLA. So let's leave poor Virginia alone for a minute here. Let's talk about the top of the division and what you expect to be the top. So it's Georgia Tech is the favorite, coming off, again, one of the more outstanding seasons we've seen out of this division in about 5 years, since Virginia Tech was closer to the nation's elite. What are some of those matchups you're looking forward to this season that are going to decide it? And also, I want to throw out Miami to you guys. Miami might be the most talented team in this division based on recruiting rankings and what we've seen recently in the NFL draft, but the results haven't followed suit.
Yeah, so as I look into it, I think some of the key matchups, one of the classic ones through the years has always been Georgia Tech against Virginia Tech. That's a home game this year for the Yellow Jackets. It's a Thursday night game at Bobby Dodd Stadium. It's a classic Thursday night game, and it's great that they're bringing it back. I think that one could very well have a huge role in how this division shakes out. You're right that Miami has all the talent in the world. It seems to me that they've lacked kind of like a mental fortitude, if you will. Seem a little mentally weak. They pointed out the last couple of years after they've played and lost to Florida State that team has absolutely fallen apart and really not gotten anything done. I think that they were 6-3 going into the game last year, and then they lost their last 4, including that game. So I think that's definitely a team that at any point it could break out, and they have the talent to get it done. It's just a matter of can they hold it together through a tough loss or two. North Carolina is another one that's very talented, and they can put up some video game numbers with their offense. One of the best quarterbacks in the ACC with Marquise Williams. The defense has been semi-non-existent, and so that's, I think, the biggest question there. But again, they're kind of close to being able to do something. As I mentioned, Virginia Tech, great defense coming back as always. Bud Foster continues to just dominate with that defense up there, but the offense has been anemic. You know, it's really hard for me to pick a favorite, and I think a lot of these head-to-head matchups could go either way. A little bit of what I was talking about last week with if Virginia Tech can get anything out of their offense, or if North Carolina can get anything out of their defense, I think those will really throw a wrench into any of the other favorites. But a lot of these head-to-head matchups, really, it's going to turn into a bit of a round robin.
You know, if we had Jeff Greenberg, our old friend here, to trumpet North Carolina's cause, he would have us all convinced that they were going to play Alabama caliber defense this season after the disaster that was last season, giving up 70 points to East Carolina, and that wasn't the end of it. It was practically every week from East Carolina or from North Carolina letting Rutgers look like a world beater on offense in the bowl game. So, Jim, I'm going to throw out the Miami question to you and any other hot spots that you see in this division, but I think Joey brings up a good point with Florida State, or with Miami against Florida State. That's been their watershed game for the last 2 seasons. Yeah, they weren't tearing the world up prior to the FSU game last year, but 6-3, then they lose the last 4. The year before, they were undefeated going up against Florida State, and then they just wilted down the stretch. So Miami's got to get past that. Old Al Golden, I'll give him all the credit in the world for stabilizing the program when it was in trouble, but now it's time to win. That hasn't happened. And, of course, we want to hear about your Pitt Panthers too, Jim.
Well, looking at Miami, they only have about 3 or 4 starters back on offense, so that obviously concerns me. They relied a lot on Duke Johnson last year. So developing a running back to really complement Brad Kaya at quarterback is going to be key. Joseph Yerby is one of the guys that they're looking at to play running back. So another thing with Miami that does concern me is Georgia Tech also has this problem. They have to play Florida State and Clemson, both of them, and no other team in the section has to do that. So those are big, very big games. That's something that could definitely decide the section. That could be a loss in the division. So, looking at Miami, that's definitely going to be an issue for them. Then, to talk about Pitt, I've been on the show a few times this year, and what I've been saying all along is I really do like their offense. James Conner's a great running back. They have 4 starters back on the line. Their tight end back, J.P. Holtz, Tyler Boyd, All-American wide receiver. So, like many teams in this division, North Carolina can put up points, Duke can put up points, Georgia Tech. It's a very high-scoring division. and seems to be defense is lacking all across the board.
Joey brings up the point about the scheduling, and then you capitalized on it there, Jim, and I think it's a great point. I talk about it all the time. I'm actually in the midst of looking at every schedule in the country, and then I start to do that, and then I think, why did you start to do it this? But anyway, I'm looking at every schedule in the country, breaking them down, and that's huge, especially, and I'm not just zeroing in on the ACC, but you look at the SEC and the Big Ten, especially these 14-team conferences. After you play everyone in your own division, you're looking at 2 games against the other 7 in the other division, and the discrepancy in schedules can be huge. When you only play 8 games, and 2 games for one team could be Clemson, Florida State, and for another could be Wake and Syracuse, that could decide the division right now, especially in a coastal division where, for the most part, aside from Georgia Tech possibly distinguishing itself again, it's muddled up. Dan, is there anything here that catches your attention?
Well, I think the scheduling's probably the biggest part, and I focus on Miami as being a victim of a lot of things. Just to tie that off, and I think the one thing that I think we kind of overlook with Miami is, number one, the loss of 9 football scholarships. Al Golden still, I don't think, has a full 4-year recruit. He's been there 4 years. He has a full recruiting cycle under his belt, but Miami has treaded water while losing 9 scholarships. I don't remember how they broke it up, if they took it all as a hit in 1 year or if they did it over a couple of years, but they had the scepter hanging over them, and then the hammer fell enough to cause Al Golden to say, all right, I got to get through this. He might not be able to get through it, which is kind of the problem, that you're looking for an immediate return. And then when you factor in the schedule, Miami plays a brutal out-of-conference schedule. They've got, number one, the out-of-division games against Clemson and Florida State, and then they're tacking on a game against Nebraska. Cincinnati, I don't like that as a matchup. I just don't like it. There's something about it that doesn't smell fun for the Canes. And some waning. They moved out of the Orange Bowl. They moved into Dolphin Stadium full time. Some of the different aspects of it, they're starting to feel the impact of. And when you factor in then the other side of it, which you guys are exactly right with the scheduling, if you're playing 2 out of divisional games against the 2 best teams potentially in the ACC, it's a recipe for disaster and almost a no-win situation. That's also why I probably won't pick Miami, no matter how much I want to, do this to the camera and pick them. I'm not going to be able to pick them to win the division, and that's what might inhibit Georgia Tech from winning the division this year too, of those 2 out-of-divisional games.
Yeah, definitely. And when you start to handicap any race, you look at the quarterback position and think, okay, who's stable there? Who has the question marks? Who has the unknowns versus who's stable at quarterback? The one difference in this Miami team versus the recent additions at Miami might be Brad Kaya might not just be a capable college quarterback. This kid's probably a pro quarterback. He's that good. We saw him on the big stage on opening night against Louisville as a true freshman. We saw him go to Nebraska. He's already been under fire, and he turned in a pretty good season and got better as it went along. So I'm pretty sold on Brad Kaya being an exceptional quarterback this season. So, Joey, start us out on some quarterback talk in terms of what we have in this division.
Yeah, as I look at it, I thought it was kind of neat because there's about 3 distinct tiers as I look at it as far as quarterback situations. So like you mentioned, Kaya, actually with Miami, that does fit into my top tier. I think a lot of people would maybe point out the hiccups and the speed bumps that he had last year, but I'm with you. I thought he was a good quarterback and kind of developed through the year, and with them being game number 11, the weekend before Thanksgiving for Georgia Tech, I'm really interested to see how different he is from game number 5 last year. I think they said that he was the only quarterback in NCAA history as a true freshman to throw for 3,000 yards and 25 touchdowns. So I think that's a good situation. Obviously, Georgia Tech with Justin Thomas, possibly the best playmaker in the conference and one of the best playmakers in the country. You saw what he could do in the Orange Bowl. He actually led the team in rushing, went over 1,000 yards last year. He should be back and better as a junior. And the other guy that I look at as kind of a top-tier quarterback is Marquise Williams there at North Carolina. He was that offense. He threw for over 3,000 yards, ran for almost 1,000 more, scored something like 34 touchdowns for him. So I think that's a really desirable situation. I moved down a tier, and I go to Pittsburgh, where they got Chad Voitek. He definitely has some upside to him, really good mobility. I think he was their second leading rusher last year. Definitely has a few of those speed bumps as well. And the only reason I mark him lower than Kaya would be that he is older, and I would expect the things from Kaya maybe more so than from Wojtek. And then in that same tier, I would include Michael Brewer at Virginia Tech, a guy who was not particularly impressive last year. Again, that offense has been kind of a disaster, and he really didn't make it a whole lot better, making a lot of mistakes. And so we'll see if he can get better moving into this year. And then that bottom tier, I'm looking at Duke and Virginia. Duke having to replace Anthony Boone, and Virginia having to replace Grayson Lambert. Lambert obviously transferred out, whereas Boone graduated. I don't know that either of those guys really have a great replacement in order. It really, for Virginia, we were kind of joking before the call got started of, who is Virginia's quarterback, and it's like that's the point. Nobody's really sure, and I'm not even sure they are. So definitely those are the bottom two, and especially for Duke, that's a real departure from the recent years.
Okay, folks, you're watching or listening to ACC Breakdown. So we're here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, breaking down ACC football. So once we start playing football, look out. We're going to be recapping a little bit, but mostly looking forward to that particular weekend's game. So it's going to be a whole lot of fun bringing on bloggers, broadcasters from all over the ACC. So, Jim, before I kick it to you, your thoughts about Chad Wojtek. We've had this conversation in the past. They kind of loosened up the offense going down the stretch. How did they use Connor versus Wojtek in terms of balancing using Tyler Boyd downfield, developing Wojtek versus using your workhorse, and then any other quarterback situations that jump out to you in the Coastal?
Well, talking about Chad Wojtek first, like we've mentioned all along, Pitt really had a tight rein on him to begin. They were running the ball a lot, and they weren't giving him a lot of trust. As the year progressed, he got better. They were able to use his feet a little bit more. He was more comfortable throwing to people other than Tyler Boyd. There was a point where he was just locking in on him almost every play. So he started to throw to his tight ends, found some secondary receivers. So I think going into this year, I really like Chad Wojtek. I like Jim Chaney, the offensive coordinator, coming from Arkansas, guy with pro experience. I think that's a really good situation for Wojtek. But another one that jumps out at me is Duke with Thomas Sirk. I think he was their bigger kind of bulldozing type quarterback. And it's going to be interesting to see how their offense goes from where it was. Because I just picture the past two games when Pitt and Duke met have been absolute barn burners, unbelievable games. And Duke has this very high-powered offense. So I just want to know where they go from there with more of a physical quarterback type situation.
Yeah, there's no doubt it's impressive what David Cutcliffe has been able to pull off. We knocked out ACC coaches rankings, and everybody was very high on David Cutcliffe, but despite being 8 games under 500 for his career at Duke, he's done the job at Ole Miss. We know what he's done with the Manning boys, and then he comes to Duke, and you have to understand the history of Duke football and even the current limitations to appreciate winning 3 consecutive seasons, getting to bowl competition, getting to decent bowl games, not just squeaking in at 6-6, getting to an ACC championship game, only losing 8 games the past 2 years. So it's been a nice job by David Cutcliffe there. So, Dan, looking at the quarterback situation, and I'll even open it up beyond that in terms of what players excite you in this division, do we possibly have a Heisman dark horse anywhere?
Well, if I'm going to pander to the crowd and say I love me some Justin Thomas and I love me some Chad Wojtek. I've made no secret that I love those two guys, namely because Justin Thomas is a triple option quarterback who can actually throw the football. It's like watching it's amazing. It's like watching a guy who can actually – it's almost like watching one of those guys who played in high school and he could just – you gave him the ball and he was playing quarterback because he was the naturally gifted athlete on the field. But a guy like Thomas, if you can throw the ball and do the triple option, all of a sudden you've got a quadruple option. And Paul, the only person who can screw that up would be the offensive coordinator if he decides to start throwing the ball more, it gets seduced by a certain thing, or if it doesn't work out that way. So I'm not going to go too far onto that, but I love me some Justin Thomas. And I love a Chad Wojtek. I've said repeatedly, I think he's one of the more underrated quarterbacks, namely because you need a guy who can execute the system. He was a guy who was recruited by he wasn't recruited by Paul Christ. The guy who was there before me escapes me. But he was recruited by
Todd
one
Graham.
coach. Yeah, Graham. So he was recruited by Graham. He played for Christ, and after playing for Christ, now he's on his third coach, essentially, and he's very level-headed. Last year was his first year as a starter, but he's learned, he's gotten better. I love him a lot. But my guy, and I realize by saying this, I'm going with a guy who every time I'm going to be that guy who gets seduced by Virginia Tech and Michael Brewer. Every year, Virginia Tech seems to have a guy that is supposed to be otherworldly. Virginia Tech fans will come up to Boston when they play Boston College, and they'll tell me how this guy is going to lead this team, provided the season hasn't collapsed by then, to either an ACC championship, or he's the best thing to happen since the invention of the wheel, and then it all falls out. I think Michael Brewer, as a senior, might actually be a good enough quarterback that can win 10 games with Virginia Tech. When you consider what they got on defense, he's your dark horse, because if that defense just keeps giving him options, with any luck, like I said, the only person who can screw that up will be the coach. Unfortunately, I don't particularly care for Frank Beamer these days, but I love Brewer down there in Virginia Tech.
Hey, if we were having this discussion about 11 months ago after the Ohio State game, we would be singing the praises of Michael Brewer, because he's not the biggest guy in the world. So he's not exactly John Elway standing in the pocket or Ben Roethlisberger taking shots. He's a little guy, and he stood up against that Ohio State pass rush and delivered dimes. And then he wasn't quite the same guy all season, and I remember seeing him against Virginia late in the year, and despite the issues the Cavaliers had, they were very strong on defense. They beat him up, got beat up in the bowl game, had to leave the game for a few series. He's kind of a frail guy. He's not the biggest guy, prototypical pocket passer, so he gets beat up a little bit, and that kind of leads me into the Virginia Tech deal, because this program, Frank Beamer, regardless of what happens the rest of his career, has established himself as an all-time great, taking a program that was decent. It was in the abyss at one point, was decent under Coach Dooley. He brings it to national prominence. They dominate the ACC for a period of time and certainly shared that dominance with Florida State more recently. And now they're losing 5 or 6 football games, and it's been 4 or 5 years since they've been really good. Look at the defense, though, and they can play defense with just about anybody in the country. They still have lockdown quarters. They still have defensive tackles that could plug it up. Big Daddy Nicholas, the outside pass rushers. They are pretty loaded on defense. They don't scare you on offense. They don't have the perimeter guys. They don't have the guy running the football. They found a few guys late in the season and established a running game against the likes of, again, Virginia and Cincinnati in the bowl game. But any thoughts out there on Virginia Tech getting back into the mix and challenging Georgia Tech?
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of like you were mentioning, they are scary good on defense, and that's kind of what I keep harping on. But the thing that I notice is that I think that they might have a top 10 defensive line nationally, as well as a top 10 secondary nationally. Just all sorts of talent going to be on the field, and that defense is going to have to carry them if they're going to make some noise in the ACC. And the thing is, I think that's very possible. Their offense doesn't have to be that good, as you were talking about. Brewer could get them there. He sure could. He doesn't have to be that good with how good that defense is. And so I think that's really how the season is going to go for Virginia Tech. Is the offense good enough to get them over the hump? Maybe not necessarily good, but good enough.
Hey, Jim, are there any other keys in this race? So if you look at a particular player, a particular unit, a question mark that if it's answered the right way, you think this particular team could challenge Georgia Tech?
Honestly, not to sound like a total homer, but I think if Pitt really does put some things together, I don't think they're that far out of it. I look at all the teams they've played. They've been in the ACC 2 years. They've split with Virginia Tech. They've split with Duke. Played 2 tough games with Carolina. They split with Miami. Went down to Georgia Tech 2 years ago. Played them tough. So they really aren't that far off. I mean, they've had the defensive player of the year in the conference with Aaron Donald, offensive player of the year in James Conner. It just seems that everything kind of gets pushed the right way. It could work out. I don't think I'm that crazy.
So, Joey, I'm going to give you a chance to sell us on why Georgia Tech is not just the best team in the division like they were last season, but that they could be building dynasties. Way too strong a term, but the program in the division in terms of what they established last year, pretty much what they've done with Virginia Tech. As I mentioned, 9 out of 10 championship game appearances. Is this program distinguishing himself, or was that possibly just a really good aberration of things coming together last year?
I think it's yet to be seen if they can sustain it, kind of like you were talking about. Over the history, we've had pop-up 9, 10, 11-win seasons, but very rarely been able to sustain that success. But I think that they are set up pretty well right now. This program is as deep as it's been in decades, I think. Paul Johnson's been recruiting very, very well over the last few years, got a lot of young talent. I think this is looking like it's going to be the second year in a row that they're playing something like 8, 9, 10 true freshmen, whereas recent years before that it's been something like 2 or 3. And I think it kind of speaks to the quality of the freshmen that they're bringing in. Certainly after the 2009 season, they went to the Orange Bowl, won the ACC title and all that. 2010, they win 6 games, lost to Kansas. It was a bad season. And I think that the difference is that depth. The biggest question that they're going to have to answer is on offense. They lost the entire 3 deep at B-back, I think 5 of their top 6 A-backs, and they have 2 receivers that are now playing on Sundays. And so basically it's Justin Thomas, the offensive line, and a whole new cast of characters around him. So the question is, can they get anywhere near what they were in 2014? But on defense, I think that they're set up extremely well for this year. And they've got a lot of seniors, a lot of returning starters. I think 8 starters on defense are coming back from last year. Sets up really nicely, and there's a lot of talent moving forward that should be able to fill in even once some of the older guys are gone.
And going back to our quarterback discussion, I think he would win a lot of bets throwing out the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, Joey, Justin Thomas led the ACC in pass efficiency.
Yeah,
yes, he did.
Yeah, you'd have a tough time getting that one right at a trivia night. But he's as good of a passer as you were talking about earlier. I think for him, the thing is obviously not hitting those passes in quantity, but hitting the quality of them. And if you can just do enough to keep the defense honest, hit a few big plays. Georgia Tech was also one of the best offenses in the country last year on 3rd and long, which is like one of the most bizarre things. If you had told me that going into the year, I would have kind of looked at you funny, like, did I hear that right? So definitely a guy who is not one-dimensional, and that's probably the first time you can really say that about a quarterback in the Paul Johnson era at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, there's only so many Baylor passing offenses out there. If you're going to have either or, you'd rather have the guy that's going to hit 50, 52%, but he doesn't throw picks, and he hits for big yardage and converts 3rd downs and kills the defense with huge plays, rather than the guy that hits 68% and they're all dump-offs in the backfield to the running back in the flat. So that's good. I gave this schedule, guys, a quick look here in the last few weeks, and I think it all comes down to you've got Virginia Tech taking on Georgia Tech, North Carolina down the stretch. You've got Georgia Tech with Virginia Tech, Miami before they go out of conference to Georgia, and you got a Pitt-Miami game on the last weekend of the season that could factor into things too. So hopefully, unless Virginia or Georgia Tech runs away again a little bit and hides, which those Clemson Florida State matchups may bring them back to the pack along with Florida or with Miami. This may not get out of hand and may be real fun going down the stretch. So, Dan, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to leave it wide open to whatever you want to talk about in terms of Coastal Division football, Dan. Okay, get focused here. Let's stay with ACC Coastal stuff here. So, not anything you want to talk about, but then I want your predictions, and I would love to hear a dark horse. And I really want to find out if you guys think Georgia Tech's going to run away with it or if there's somebody who can really challenge them. So I'm going to go Dan, then I'm going to go Jim and Joey.
Well, I think there's one team that we haven't talked about enough, and Jeff Goldberg's going to love me for this, but it's North Carolina. North Carolina, they got Gene Chizik in there as the defensive coordinator. And like I've been saying about Wake Forest offense, the North Carolina defense cannot possibly be that bad this year. They were one of the worst defenses in college football last year. I don't think they can necessarily be that bad, especially when they know they're going to have all of that added attention on it. At the same time, even if the offense isn't that as good, they've still got a good enough schedule, or an easy enough schedule, a favorable schedule, to get them into a position to key on certain games. Their out-of-conference schedule is, outside of that game against South Carolina, is lacking. They're playing North Carolina, A&T, and Delaware. We're not talking about games that light the world on fire. But when you're looking at their crossover game, they're playing Wake Forest, who is not particularly strong, and then they have their game at the end of the year with a rivalry against NC State. Now, here's the thing about NC State. NC State, we know, plays a weak non-conference schedule and usually beefs up their stats that way. If North Carolina can key in on the key games, they get Georgia Tech after they play a cupcake in Delaware. They get Pittsburgh after they play Virginia. They get Miami after they play Duke. The only thing that could potentially skip them up is the fact they have to go on the road to Virginia Tech after they play Miami. So if the ball gets rolling and the defense starts to at least gel a little bit, North Carolina could surprise a lot of people this year. Of course, every year North Carolina is supposed to be the team that surprises people, and then they go 7-5.
All right, Jim, have some fun and handicap this thing for us. Try to sort it out for us.
Well, I'm not going to pick against Georgia Tech. They are the favorites. They're the defending champs. They deserve to be picked number one as of right now. We did talk about their tough schedule, not only in the conference, but going to Notre Dame, having Georgia come to town. They're going to have to run into a lot of problems. After that, at Virginia Tech, I like their defense a lot, and something I want to talk about is that game opening night, Ohio State coming to Lane Stadium. What an opportunity for them in the conference and the division. Put their best foot forward and see what they can do against Ohio State. After that, I do a Pitt and Miami, and I think they're interchangeable. Like you mentioned, that game right after Thanksgiving, I think that could go either way. Fortunately for Pitt, it is in Pittsburgh, and South Beach and Pittsburgh weather doesn't match up, so I kind of like Pitt there. And my surprise team is also North Carolina. I think, like Dan was saying, just by default, they kind of have to be the surprise team. They're always that way. And I have Duke and Virginia following those 5 up.
So I got Jim with Georgia Tech. Dan, did you muddle through that? Was that a North Carolina prediction to win the division?
Oh, no, I'm just saying they're going to be a surprise. I'm still picking Georgia Tech to win the division.
Georgia Tech. All right. I love what Jim has to say about that Virginia Tech-Ohio State game, because we covered ACC perception and what the conference has to do for the college football playoff and all that. We're focused on the Coastal right here, but real quick, I think people are assuming Ohio State's going to get revenge. They're going to go down there and just annihilate Virginia Tech, but I don't see that happening with that Virginia Tech defense. Blacksburg, Labor Day night. Ohio State's a superior team. There's no question about that. But I think Virginia Tech's going to show up, and that's going to be an intriguing game. And you talk about solidifying some reputation and some brownie points for the ACC if Virginia Tech's able to pull off a back-to-back, knowing that they're not sneaking up on Ohio State this year. That would be epic for the conference, a conference that people are thinking, with what happened to Baylor and TCU last year, may get left out of the college football playoff, despite what Georgia Tech accomplished last year, Florida State 2 years ago, and let's not forget Clemson winning 3 consecutive bowl games against top competition. All right, Joey, can I just mark you down for Georgia Tech, or what could unravel for the Yellow Jackets? What would be the most likely scenario that gets everybody else back into the race?
Well, I actually want to start with something that Dan said. I thought was kind of funny about UNC, maybe winning 9 or 10 games, but expectations and all that. I thought it was kind of funny, and Bill Conley of SB Nation goes through and previews every FBS team, and the thing that he said was about North Carolina was that we're sitting here trying to convince ourselves that it's UNC is going to win 9 or 10 games, so it must be the offseason. I think that's been kind of a funny running joke a little bit, but I am picking Georgia Tech to win the division again. I think that one of the cool things, if you look back in 2010, again, that bad 6-7 season at Georgia Tech, they went 4-4 in the conference. That's the worst Paul Johnson has ever done with a conference record at Georgia Tech. Every other year has been 5-3, 6-2, or 7-1. So I fully expect that trend to continue. The defense looks like it's going to be improved this year. The offense might take a step back with some talent loss, but should still be very good. There are actually two teams I'm kind of looking for. We talked about North Carolina. There are two other teams that I'm looking that I think could legitimately, maybe make a step up. The first one you might have caught on is Virginia Tech. That defense is that good. They're going to be very tough to get by this year. I think if their offense, they've got some pieces in place maybe to get something going with their running game. If that team could find a way to put up 30 points a game, they'll win 10 games this year. So they're one that I look at, and the other one is actually going to make Jim really happy. I actually think that Pitt might have a chance. They do have some pieces there on offense. That defense is already pretty decent, and with Pat Narduzzi coming in, a very successful defensive coordinator at Michigan State, I think that he'll be able to do something good with them as well. I think you have to worry about some growing pains there with being a first-year coach and kind of learning a new system a little bit. But I think they're a team to keep an eye on too. And honestly, again, there's about 5 teams that I think have a legitimate shot at winning the division. If there's anything more ACC about this whole situation. So
it's a clean sweep for Georgia Tech between Joey, Dan, and Jim. Georgia Tech, 3-game sweep there in the predictions for 2015. I'll make one more note of significance about this schedule. We mentioned Georgia Tech's got to face the 2 toughies in the other division, Clemson and Florida State. Virginia Tech's other 2, North Carolina State at home and Boston College on the road. So let's say everything's equal between those 2 teams, and let's say even Georgia Tech beats Virginia Tech head-to-head and loses to Clemson and Florida State, Virginia Tech could still win the division, and that's the only one I take of note. I could go through the other schedules, aside from Miami, who also has to play Clemson and Florida State. That's how important the scheduling is. The best team usually wins, yes, but sometimes the schedules are that far off in that 2-game stretch that it makes a difference. All right, it's ACC Breakdown. You guys took it easy on me this week. Guys were cutting me down from time to time, but they were a kinder and gentler panel of contributors this week. So we'll mix it up next time, I'm sure. So we got Dan Rubin from BC Interruption. We got Jim Hammett from Cardiac Hill on the SB Nation platform for Pitt. And also from SB Nation, we got Joey Weaver from the Rumble C. This is ACC Breakdown each and every Wednesday at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and I can't wait until we've got some football to talk about, gentlemen.
Looking forward to it.
All right, we'll see you next time.